welcome you all today. My name is Jenny DeGroot. I'm the children's librarian here at Orcas Island Public Library, and it's my pleasure to introduce Russell and to have him come and talk about island bat ecology here and conservation. I will say that before I start, I really should thank the Ken Gibbs Memorial Fund for youth science education for supporting today's program. Many of you already know Russell, so it's probably, he doesn't need a huge introduction, but if you don't know Russell, he is the director of the nonprofit KWIAHT, which is an island-based science organization that is run basically by islanders. And so KWIAHT has a bunch of scientists and interns and volunteers. Some of you might even be in the room here, and they study all types of things, not just bats, but shorebirds, ticks, amphibians, and everything from deer poo. If it's an emergent issue, KWIAHT is certainly probably studying it. KWIAHT also has 7 research teams on 4 separate islands, and they're conducting monitoring of all types of organisms. And this is, I think we so need this in this unprecedented time of change, how important monitoring is. The first time I met Russell, my children at the time were quite small, and there was Russell and his team were doing a seine out in Indian Island, one of their research sites, and they were pulling up a bunch of fish and different things. And I remember Russell spent a lot of time talking to my daughter about a particular crab. I don't really remember what she learned, but I certainly know that his enthusiasm for science was certainly infectious. And that is a real gift. It's not a surprise that the 2 most recent high school graduates that got the Climate Leadership Scholarship were actually KWIAHT interns. So I want to say thank you, Russell, for all the hard work that you do protecting our environment, and also for being such a great role model for the next generation of scientists. So with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Russell. If you could please join me.
Thank you. I'd never really expected that I would be studying bats. I started in invertebrate paleontology, and so I was looking at brachiopods. I've only run into one other brachipod biologist in many years since I finished university. But bats were something that my attention was drawn to by colleagues actually in the federal land management agencies who were raising questions about bat fauna here in the San Juan Islands, and what species were here and what habitat they were using 20 years ago, and found that there was little information. 2 weeks of recording had been done in the 1990s. And before that, the only work on bats in the San Juan Island was when Bob Dahlquist, who was the director of the Washington State Museum, the Burke in Seattle, vacationed at Lakedale on San Juan Island in 1946 and brought his shotgun. He went back to Seattle with a bag of bats. And that was what was known until the 90s, when we got 2 weeks of reporting on Lopez Island. And we began doing more systematic investigations, basically 2 branches, one responding to residents of the islands, to islanders who were seeing bats, had bats in their houses, bats in their barn, looking at human-bat interactions, which gave us a great opportunity to see what bats were doing and which ones were around, and also building a recording system, a network of recorders listening for bats every night. These are automated recorders, which is now up to 8 different recorders on 4 islands, and I think at this point we've exceeded 1 million records of bat flyovers, so from which we can at least get an idea of which species are where, at which times of year, what they're doing, where they're traveling, and how that changes not only from season to season, but from year to year. I'll show you a little bit of that data, but I want to dive into some basic bat biology, which I think is really interesting and often gets overlooked when compared to questions that people raise, like, how do I get this bat out of my house? Or if I get, will I get bitten by a bat and get rabies? Those kinds of urgent issues, as opposed to a deep dive into this really cool group of animals. And let me preface that by pointing out that because we're on islands, all of the animal fauna here has had to get here somehow from the mainland. The islands were covered with a mile of ice 10,000 years ago. When that ice melted, it was initially fresh water and then salt water that separated the islands from the mainland. So things that could fly, at least long distances, or swim long distances, were the first to colonize the islands. And we are still in a position where our animal fauna is, ecologists would describe it, depauperate. We don't have as many animals living here, many species living here, as on the nearby mainland. And we don't have the same mix of species as the mainland. One of the things on the mainland that is very familiar in this region is that the rodents, the small ground mammals led by the rodents, make up the largest group of species in Washington state, but not in the islands. The bats make up the largest group of species in San Juan County, more than rodents, and that's because they fly. So let's dive into bats a little bit, and then we'll loop around to some information on the islands. I have some show and tell, and to talk about bat detectors, and also can answer questions about specific island issues with bats and bat conservation and living with bats. Also, I've left behind some literature, both single sheets and some spiral-bound booklets on bats that we've put out. Take them. They're all free. If they run out or you have further questions, just contact our office, contact info@KWIAHT.org, and we'll try to give you the answers that you're seeking. Okay, so into bats. Well, the first thing is, we say it, but it has some very important implications. Bats are mammals. They're very strange mammals, but like other mammals, they nurse their young. There's maternal investment in baby bats. They live long lives, 20 years or so for a female bat, for a bat mother. They're gregarious and sociable. They form social groups that are highly interactive within a large bat colony. The moms are all helping nurse and clean and cuddle each other's pups. So they live in variously sized extended families. From some species, just mom and a couple of pups and maybe a sister or two, to many of our species here in the islands there are colonies here in the islands of 500 to 1,000. Enormous cities of bats. But the important thing from understanding bats is maternal investment and learning. A bat colony has a bunch of old ladies, old lady bats in their teens and 20s, which is very old for a small mammal, that know the countryside, and they learn by going out and foraging and raising pups together. Flight has evolved multiple times in the animal kingdom, and bats are the newest member of the flight club. The initial flying animals were insects, and we have fossil records of flying insects from 400 million years ago. So it's sort of the edge between domination of animals in the sea to the colonization of the land by land animals, not just vertebrates, but also insects and arachnids. And so insects first, then the pterosaurs, which are a separate group, should be considered not ancestral. They're not ancestral to the birds, but a group of flying reptiles with skin-covered wings, to the avian dinosaurs. The birds are dinosaurs. They're in the dinosaur clade and are the remaining dinosaurs that developed to use their feathers for warmth and flight, instead of, just as we begin to suspect now initially having feathers for display, to show off, like the feathers of roosters for sexual display. So the avian dinosaurs, about 145, 150 million years ago, and then very recently, at about the same depth evolutionarily as the emergence of the primates from which we are the descendants, the bats emerge as the first and only mammals to fly on their own power. Very important, and the emergence of bats is very much tied to the development of the birds, because birds and bats have a lot of the same food. That's particularly true in our region, where our bats are almost all insectivorous, and we have lots of insectivorous birds. And we end up, as you may have seen on a summer evening, with the day crew and the night crew. The day crew is like the swallows. Then you get a little transitional crew. The martins and the swifts are out as the sun gets low in the sky. And then as the sun dips behind the horizon, the birds go to sleep and the bats come out. So birds and bats essentially are part of a functional group that regulates insects in North American environments. And bats emerge as the insects evolutionarily go into the night to get away from the birds. Bats follow them there. But bat flight is really interesting because it's not quite like bird flight. That's a bird wing of X-rays, of a bird wing down on the bottom and bat wings up on top. A bird basically has a finger, and the wing itself is just the feathers that are growing out of the skin on the foreleg of the bird. A bat stretches skin on its fingers, and so its fingers form the structure that holds the wing. That gives the bat much greater control. It can play origami with its wings, which birds cannot. As a result, bats have extraordinary maneuverability. I was watching bats a couple of nights ago, and watching them flying about 25, 26 miles per hour, stopping, stalling, and turning, just zip, and off the other way. Birds can't do that. They don't have enough control over their flight surfaces. So bats have evolved a different kind of wing that has more stretchy geometry than bird wings. And where you see that most interestingly in ecology is the war between bats and owls. Owls are the major predator on bats in our region. And while in direct, straight, open flight, an owl can outfly a bat in terms of speed, it cannot outmaneuver a bat. How many of you remember seeing the rocket sled scene in the first Star Wars? Shooting between the trees, remember that? That's a bat escaping an owl, where the owl is banging into things because it can't turn quickly enough, and the bat is sliding in between obstacles at full tilt without any deceleration at all. So in the life of a bat, that ability to maneuver so finely is not just a really good way of going after insects, of hunting, but also a tremendous way of evading predators. That's an example of bat flight. And the difference is when birds do the upswing, they separate their feathers so the air goes through the wings, and they then close. So it's just like when people swim. When you do the backstroke, you keep your hands cupped to hold the water. But if you move forward, you can open your hands so that you don't push yourself backwards. But bats can't do that. So what they do is they fold the wing on the upswing. Fold it in and up and then out. So it's a different motion than birds in flight. Really, really cool. And potentially very, very fast. So the other thing that's really special about bats, and it's true of Most of the bats that we have in the Americas, and I'll be showing you a little bit about, we have old world bats and new world bats, and they're evolutionarily, importantly different. But here in the Americas, most of our bats find their way around by echolocation. They have perfectly good sight and perfectly good smell, but at night, sight and smell are secondary to being able to use sonar to detect a tree that's in front of you as you're flying 25 miles an hour, or a nice big fat juicy moth or fly or something that might be dinner that's moving across your path. Echolocation, and it's just playing with just bouncing sound off of objects, including insects, very much like the fish finders on the boats that we use to go out fishing and crabbing here in the islands. Echolocation is very critical for bats. It's at extremely high frequencies, which is not just because bats are really small, that they have very high squeaky voices. It's that at those very high frequencies, the wavelength is very, very short, and it can resolve, it can detect very, very small objects, so that a bat in flight can detect a fly crossing its path and track it using echolocation. Something much smaller than anything that we would attempt to do with, say, with a fish finder on a boat, which uses the same kind of technology, but uses much longer wavelengths and is aiming at much bigger things like a salmon rather than a fly. And just for fun, so this is we use these to calibrate bat detectors. It's a chirper. It just creates the same kind of sounds that many bats do. This one is set to about 40 kilohertz, so 40,000 cycles per second, which is a low-voiced bat. That's down in the basement of bats' vocal range. And I've just switched this on. Okay, so you don't hear anything, right? But if I turn on a bat detector, something that can detect and give you and report this, and that's about what a bat sounds like if you slow its echolocation chirping down by a factor of 8, which is what we do routinely when we're recording bats and then listening to them and running them through software to identify the species. It's about a 8-to-1 conversion that brings it down from, say, 80 kilohertz, 80,000 hertz, to about 10,000 hertz, which is about the level of my voice right now. So one of the things that I'll return to that's very important is how interesting bats are when you have the right tools to eavesdrop on them and to listen to them the way we listen to birds. And we begin to recognize that bats have different voices. You can identify species just like birds by listening to their voices. And you can also tell a lot about what they're doing because they say different things, like birds do, when they're doing different things. Each one doesn't have simply an echolocation chirp, but there are navigation chirps, just laying down a pattern to see what's underneath and in front of them. There are targeting chirps when they're targeting potential prey, and you'll hear it. It speeds up. It's actually it's beep, 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 as they are moving in and getting more and more precise information about the location of what they're closing on. There are feeding buzzes. Bats, like people, say yum when they swallow. And if you listen, but it's an ultrasonic yum. So if you're listening, you hear the targeting beep, 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 and then you hear, and this is the little, and then the next one. So you can actually tell how many insects they're catching by listening to their different buzzes. And then there's social chatter. And for many of our bat species, actually, when they're just hanging out with each other, close in, and they're communicating, grooming, and in cuddling, they are generally communicating at the top of our audible range, so it sounds like very high squeaking, and we can actually hear it without a bat detector, which is really interesting. They're running at about 18 to 20 kilohertz then. So people have often reported hearing squeaky mice and rats in their barn, and it turns out it's a whole bunch of bats cuddling each other and talking about it, or cuddling their pups. So we'll listen a little bit. We may have to do something to make this. Here it goes. That's this species, which is our most abundant in the islands. And that's navigational chirps that I recorded a couple of years ago. Slowed down 8 times. We'll listen to a different species and you'll off through there. Here it's a very different sound pattern. Some bats go bloop, some go beep, you can, as with birds, begin to think of bat chirps as having, as being nameable. So that's a hoary bat, a bat species that we're working on right now because it's been quite rare. We've thought it's probably the only bat species in San Juan County that migrates to the mainland sometimes, because they've been found migrating on the mainland, but they don't migrate north and south the way birds do. They just keep moving. They move around seasonally. They might go east, they might go west, north, south, just changing location within hundreds of miles. And we aren't sure yet whether they do that in the San Juan Islands, but we don't hear them very often. And they only make up about 5% of the calls that we can hear. They're our biggest bat in North America. They look like little fuzzy teddy bears, and they're about the size of a chipmunk. Very, very interesting, and we just discovered a large population of them on the west side of San Juan Island. In the dry woodlands on the west side of San Juan Island. We're starting to map it out, see if we can figure out how many bats are there, how many roosts, and there's been some talk with the state of the possibility, because hoary bats are big enough to carry a little radio transmitter. Most bats aren't. Most bats are weigh less than a quarter. But hoary bats weigh about as much as a quarter. So you can put a transmitter, or a little 1/10 of a gram transmitter on them without them really noticing. And there's telemetry in Victoria, BC. There's a big antenna, big bat antenna pointed across Harrow Strait, so that if we get them tagged, we can start following them around.
So I was on PayPal.
We have many large bats. So you really, yeah, so I'll just show you, before we leave the slide. So here's a California Myotis, Myotis californicus. And it weighs about 1/10 of a gram. These are from a collection we have of bats that unfortunately didn't make it for one reason or another, and are part of a DNA archive of island bats that we are using so that we have a record biologically of the bats that are living on different islands. So little California Myotis, tiny, tiny little ears. We call them mouse-eared bats, the Myotis bats, have little tiny mouse ears, and as you can see, quite small. But a big brown bat, which is actually a kind of bat, Aptesius fuscus is its scientific name. Big brown bats look very similar, but they're much bigger. So there's a big brown. Very similar structure, the little face, little ears. If you see a big brown in a photograph and it's not scaled, you could easily mistake one of these for one of the little Myotis bats. And actually they like each other. They're like geese and ducks, and I find very often if there's a roost of little mouse-eared Myotis bats, that they'll have 15 or 20 big browns living with them and just hanging out and just living alongside them. So that's an idea of basic difference between our Myotis bats and the other species, the 4 other species that we have here in the islands. Our rarest bat and most important one is Townsend's big-eared bat, which is, here's a Townsend's. And one thing about Townsend's is that they have very prominent ears, which none of our other local species have. They have little bunny ears, and they roll up. Remember those party favors that you blew in and they unrolled? These are like that in reverse. When a Townsend is napping, they're rolled up, and when they awake, they unroll and go straight up. And they also flop around when the bat is flying. So you may see a large bat, and if you look carefully, you can see if it has those, if you can see the ears, then it's a Townsend. And these are under very careful management right now. They're considered critically endangered in the eastern United States, and they are considered a species of concern, a priority species by Washington State. There are believed to be about 1,500 Townsends living in Washington State, and right now we think that 200 to 300 of them live in San Juan County. We don't know why they like San Juan County. We like San Juan County, but we're not bats. So then whatever is attracting them here, and it could be prey, it could be lack of disturbance, good woodland, they are comfortable living with people, they're also comfortable living in the woodlands. We're still trying to figure out why the islands appear to be a refuge for this species. And also, if we can figure out why they like it, we can also protect whatever it is that is keeping them here, because we probably have between a fifth and a third of the entire state population here in San Juan County, enough that it's attracting a lot of attention from the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, just to see that they stick around. So I promised something about Old World and New World bats. When you say bat, most people tend to think about fruit bats, these guys, which are very large comparatively. They can weigh up to 4 pounds, not a tenth of an ounce, or a bit less than a tenth of an ounce, but these are the weight of a quarter, a dime or a quarter. Fruit bats, several pounds. Big bats, very fox-like faces, predominantly frugivores eating fruit and flowers. They are, when you look at them closely, you can see that they have big snouts. They don't tend to echolocate, they tend to fly by smell. Which, if you're trying to find some very sweet overripe fruit, is a really good way to find what you're looking for. On the other hand, there are the little microbats, and this is a term that's frequently used, microbats, or Microchiroptera. The microbats, predominantly insectivorous, although there are a few frugivores and then one species of vampire, blood-drinking bat. But of the hundreds and hundreds of species, typically insectivorous, very tiny, a tenth of an ounce is like the biggest microbat that you're going to find. And with, as I showed you, like 6-inch wingspans are big, whereas with a fruit bat, they can have a wingspan as big as I'm reaching. So quite different, and when you look at the little insectivorous bats, you'll notice that they have prominent ears rather than prominent noses. It's because they echolocate. So basically, fruit bats stumble around the world, big bats that stumble around sniffing out rotten fruit. And I worked in Fiji as a student, and we had fruit bats all over the hordes of them, thousands of them. Beautiful, beautiful, big, fuzzy, cheerful bats that ate the fruit that was still on the trees. These little guys are focused on insects, they're echolocating, they're tracking everything. Their world is a world of sound, of ultrasound. Very, very different creatures, and it reflects historical changes evolutionarily, with the fruit bats, as we call them, the mega bats, being restricted to tropical and subtropical old world habitats. We do not have them in the Americas. The neotropical center of activity is Amazonia, which is all microbats, but a huge diversity of microbats, literally over 100 species of microbats living in Amazonia. So these two branches of the bat family are quite distinct in terms of their ecology, their habitat, and until recently it was also suspected they might not be closely related evolutionarily either. But it turns out they are, that they separated about 40 million years ago. Now, if we look in North America, which in global terms is not particularly batful in terms of bat diversity, you'll find that actually it's the West that has the most bats. The East Coast, where there's been a tremendous amount of attention to bat conservation recently because of white nose syndrome. In fact, the heartland for bat diversity in North America is the Southwest, the desert. And we're sort of at the edge of that with 15 species in Washington state. 15 species. 9 of those species live here in the islands. But that puts us still at a relatively high level of bat diversity, species diversity, compared to the eastern part of North America. These are the species we have here. We've got the little myotis bats. California and Yuma myotis, ironically, both sound like, well, named for the Southwest, right? They were first observed in California and Arizona, where we have the greatest bat diversity in North America. But those are also our most abundant bats here in the islands. Two small mouse-eared bats that form very large colonies, and in most of San Juan County make up about 60 to 65% of all the bats flying on any given night. Then little browns, which is interesting, there are pockets of little browns. Eagle Lake here is a pocket of little browns. Then 2 relatively rare mouse-eared bats, both of which are on Orcas Island, but very few. And then the big browns, who fit together with this group behaviorally, even though they're not closely related evolutionarily or genetically. Big browns, again, hang out with little bats. All of these bats are very happy living in people's houses and barns. And I have a theory about that. As many or all of you know, long before Europeans, Euro-Americans started building timber houses here, frame houses in the islands, there were big cedar plank houses being built by native people. And those began to be built in the islands about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So bats in the islands have been living in people's attics for thousands of years, and they figure in Coast Salish art because, in fact, Coast Salish people were used to having bats living in their houses, sharing their houses with them. So we have very spoiled little bats here in the islands. They have adapted to living around the structures that people put up and living with the warmth and the safety, the dryness of human structures for a very, very long time, and still do. Then we have 3 that are somewhat different in their habits. Townsend's, the Townsend's big-eared bat that I showed you does live in houses. You are likely to find it not in an attic, but in a barn. They're not particularly fond of people, but very curious, and we're more likely to find them in barns than in actual occupied homes, but very frequently in barns. All of the big colonies that we found so far were in old barns. In fact, 2 of the 3 colonies that we found are in historical on the National Register barns, which is very interesting. They have very good taste in building. And Townsend's very curious. They react to people. They're very chill around people, and very likely also during the season, we're now realizing they move around. That we're following one colony on Lopez Island right now that moves at least 3 times each summer. The entire colony, 100+ bats. Just over a period of 2 or 3 days, they all start swarming, and then they move to another part of the island into another barn where they spend another month or so. And so they kind of go on vacation, which we don't see at all in these bats. Townsend's have this seasonal occupation pattern, which is very interesting and appears to happen everywhere that they've been studied. Then the silver-haireds and hoary bats, silver-haireds are likely to find in your woodpile. they like to sleep in woody things. They like both of these, like tree cavities. They'll roost in trees. We sometimes call them tree bats because they do not tend to roost in people's homes or barns. They stay away from people, in the woods, in trees, sometimes just sleeping, holding on to the bark of trees, on the outside of trees. Silver-haireds do, however, have this bad habit of crawling in between the sticks in wood piles. That's usually when people see them. Hoary bats are a bit of a mystery. We hear them, but they are the most isolated, and they form the smallest groups, where a hoary bat roost is basically just mom and a pair of twins. She'll have twins every year. And houries, at least, are known, they're the biggest of our bats in North America. They have considerable flight power. Houries will roost in a tree cavity, and then every few days to a week, mom will pick up her pups one at a time and fly them to another tree cavity 50, 75 feet away to fool predators. And the following week, she'll fly them one at a time to another tree cavity. So they're moving around. That's one of the things that's made it very hard to study them, because they, unlike Townsend's that'll move 2 or 3 times in the summer, houries may move every week during the summer because they're exposed, they're living alone, and it's just mom and her twins. So owls and other predators that might climb up into a tree are deadly to them, and they fool them simply by unexpectedly leaving town and going somewhere else. But this is our basic bat population as it is, and we haven't seen any evidence of other species. All of these species are also found on the mainland. Not all of them are in British Columbia. It starts getting a little too cold for many bats up there. But the fact that 9 of 15 bats that are found in Washington State are found in the San Juan Islands is an indication of how successful they were in colonizing the islands and establishing themselves here. But when I talk about a bat roost or a bat colony, the thing to bear in mind is that as little mammals, bats like to raise their pups in a warm, safe, dry place and do a lot of cuddling, and they nurse for weeks before the little bat is ready to fly. And that's the key vulnerability for our bats, is the period of time when the moms are collectively raising pups. And pups can't fly unless they're hoary bats. The moms can't lift them. If a bat gets dislodged we have seen evidence of bat moms following a pup that has fallen out of a colony and trying to feed it and cuddle it and take care of it wherever it is. We just had a relocation done with a bat pup that was basically moved into a birdhouse in a barn, in a shop. And mom went on taking care of it. They're very, very protective, but don't have the power to lift and carry babies. Incidentally, the fruit bats, the old world bats, can do that. So fruit bats carry their pups with them when they go feeding, when they go out to eat fruit. Insectivorous bats leave the pups with their sisters and their aunties, so that the pups are always being cuddled and kept warm by relatives, but they can't be carried, which makes them very vulnerable. And if there's not enough food around for mom to produce enough milk for the pups just starve and fall out of the roost, which we saw happen dramatically 2 years ago. And we actually are still seeing more pups than I'd like to see that are starving. That's an indication of, for example, having late season warming, where the insect swarms that provide the density of food, the density of prey that lactating mother bats need, doesn't happen until maybe a month after the colonies begin to birth pups, and the moms just can't find enough to eat to produce enough milk for the pups. And they've got about a month that they're going to have to feed those pups before the pups are strong enough to start flying on their own. So what do bats eat around here? Well, that's the big question we're working on right now, and we're doing it by looking at DNA, residual DNA in bat guano, in bat fecal matter. So when a bat chews up an insect, and they chew, they have nice, the teeny tiny, microscopic little teeth, but they chew like crazy, chew. And the fecal matter that pops out of a bat is chewed up insect exoskeleton with a little bit of grease and a little residual DNA mixed in. And from that residual DNA, we can identify the insects that the bat ate. We're starting to get to a point where our methods are refined enough that we think we can look at seasonal change in diets just by looking at what bats are pooping out. But what we have learned, not surprisingly, is that bats are seasonally in our area, relying on the kinds of swarming insects, mostly members of the fly family, the Diptera, in wetlands. So bats attracted to wetlands during the spring and early summer, and there are those clouds of insects that are rising out of the wetlands. Bats are targeting those at night. Then towards the fall, they seem to be switching to ground beetles. And that raises some interesting tactical questions, because ground beetles don't fly very much. So bats are, and there has been some work done on this, not in our region, but in Amazonia, of bats picking beetles off of leaves, having such fine tuning in their echolocation that as they fly by, they can detect a little bump on a leaf that's an insect and fly down and pick it off the leaf and eat a beetle that's just sitting there minding its own business, as it were. Ground beetles, like the carabid beetles that we have in all of our woodland areas here, can become an important prey item because they are active at night, they're big and juicy, and they are just as likely to be found in the fall as during the summer. So we see coleopterans, beetles show up, and then, and this is the cool thing that we just have confirmed this last year, is into the winter, the islands are warm enough that many moths that eat trees, that eat our forests, many of the moths that eat our forests, that ordinarily would be flying in September, maybe October, or starting to fly, to emerge, metamorphose and start flying in maybe March or April on the mainland, are actually flying here in December, January, and February. So with our relatively mild winters, the moths in the islands tend to emerge later in the fall and earlier in the spring than on the mainland. And that provides the food that makes it possible for bats in the islands to do something that surprised bat biologists initially about a dozen years ago when it was first reported here, and that is to remain active all winter, not to hibernate and not to migrate, but just to disperse, spread out over the countryside, and hunt moths. We're now getting down to identifying specifically which moths are critical to that diet. A lot of them are the moths whose caterpillars eat, guess what? Doug fir, very common trees, ocean spray, things like that, woody species that are common in the islands and attract huge numbers of chewing caterpillars and bugs. And for the moths, their winter emergence then makes them excellent, nice, greasy bat food. That's a clip of a hoary bat catching a moth. Look at that catch. So to see the flap that holds the tail and the legs coming up. So bats also use that to catch a baby when they give birth. When the pup comes out, it drops into that cup. But it can also be used as a moth catcher because the moths are bigger than what a bat can swallow. And that was one of the things that initially put everyone off about it. Well, moths, I mean, the bat is this big and the moth is this big, But doing this, a bat can catch a moth that's far too big for it to swallow. And then just hold on to it and chew it. Chew it down. So very, very, very cool little creatures in that respect. So I mentioned that the way we study them is acoustic. This is the kind of instrument that we have scattered around the county. We have several here on Orcas Island, several over on San Juan and Lopez, that are monitoring habitats where we have in the past noticed a lot of bat activity, so that the recorder just turns itself on. It's programmed to turn on every night and record just after sunset and just before sunrise. About 150, 200,000 recordings a year from the network that we have set up now. And we've been recording in some locations since 2014, so almost a decade.
Russell,
Yes?
to the bat, to any of the
We're trying to find that out right now. The two groups of moths that we're curious about because of their importance to gardens and to the lived ecosystem, the inhabited ecosystem here, the tent caterpillar moths, there's two tent caterpillars, two species here, and then the tortrichid moths, which are like the codling moth and apple trees. There's a cherry moth, there's a whole bunch of tortured moths that are pests of orchards and fruit trees. That's another group, but it's also one that emerges in summer. And if bats are regulating that moth population, that's a big benefit in terms of what an ecologist would call ecosystem services. So to do that, we have to zero in with our genetics. We have been using primers that let us tell, for example, whether moths are being eaten. But now we are going down to family level primers. Tortured moths, or specifically the tent caterpillar moths. And that work is being done right now this summer by our summer crew and our summer students, trying to get as specific as we can and focusing on the role of bats in regulating pests of gardens and orchards. Be very interesting. It would be surprising if they're not eating them, but we want to be sure. We know that the bats are active, that the moths are out, that moths are in the habitats that bats are heavily hunting, but we need to make the connection by finding those moths' DNA in the guano. So yeah, that's my guess also about the reason why Townsend's are doing so well. Townsend's are known from studies elsewhere in North America to prefer moths year-round, to essentially be moth specialists. And we have lots of moths, including all the moths that were accidentally introduced when the orcharding business began, when people planted the big orchards here on Orcas, for example. And a very large part of the island was covered in commercial orchards by 1910. And with them came all these doggone moths that had been pestering orchards on the East Coast, which was an enormous boon to bats, potentially, of all these nice, juicy summer, nice, greasy summer moths. So it's possible that this is all connected, and that orcharding introduced moths, which are now pests for us, but at the same time helped provide better habitat for bats, which now help manage the moths. But that story needs to be fleshed out with some hard, cold genetic facts. So this, by the way, is not the greatest for contrast in this picture, but that's a Myotis colony on Lopez that we were recently looking at. That you can really hear them too, chattering away. About 250, 300 little California Myotis, all cuddled up together. In the old days, we would people like me that were interested in this would crawl into a roost like this and spend a day and a night just watching and listening and taking notes and learning what you could from observing visually, often with night vision equipment, red lights or night vision equipment. But acoustics is just a world better in terms of being able to tell what bats are doing purely from what they're telling us. But it's complicated. So when I started talking about doing acoustic surveys, the thinking, this is 15 years ago, the thinking was, well, some bats like wetlands, and some bats like forests, and some bats like meadows, and they'll go and they'll hunt in those places because those are the places that they find the things they eat. And there was this idea that different bat species use different kinds of habitat consistently, so that there were bats that used forests and bats that used deciduous forests, bats that used conifer forests, and so on. Nonsense. Doesn't work that way at all. So this is a plot of just one summer a few years ago. This is a plot of the nightly activity at our recorder on the base of the turtle back. Each of these graph lines is one species, night after night. So here, look at this one. This is the California Myotis here, this blue line. One night. Next night, number of flyovers, number of the passes, then down, then up, then down, then down, then up, then down, then up, then down, and up. So we see these sawtooth curves where a particular habitat is visited by all of our species. We heard all 9 of them. But seasonally, there are more or fewer of them, and they vary their activity levels from night to night, which is much more active redeployment of activity. How do they know which nights to show up when the black flies are swarming or when the mosquitoes are swarming? And that goes back to the old lady bats. Because grandma, who's been feeding over that lake for 15 or 20 years, knows that the time is right and brings all of her daughters, granddaughters, nieces, and great-granddaughters out to feast. And so bats deploying their activity based on past experience and moving nightly to take advantage of concentrations of insects in different habitats So it's a very complicated dance. The evidence is that each bat colony is making nightly decisions about where to go. Yeah.
Has this graph been correlated with wind and?
Yes, we did do that. And it was interesting. We didn't get a strong correlation with anything except very high winds, because bats really can't handle them. So stormy nights, down. Everything went down. There have been arguments in the past that moon phase, for example, would be a big factor. Not really. The main thing that we see is that this seems to follow the natural rhythm of insect emergence. If you camp by a lake, one night you thick with mosquitoes, and a couple of nights later, that's passed. Something else is swarming, or maybe nothing is swarming for a few days. And bats' ability to outsmart those night-to-night variations could be the difference between a colony thriving, a big colony that needs lots of food and has lots of pups, between that colony thriving or potentially failing. So this level, I mean, what this kind of a graph, which is effectively raw data, what this tells us is it's complicated. All species are on the move all the time and are not chained to particular ecosystems. They're moving around. But if we then sort of pull out, zoom out a bit, and look at this over months or years, we begin to see some interesting variation that may be important. So this is also from the turtleback. And it's looking at just the summer, peak bat pupping and nursing season for the last 6 years. And each bar is a different species, and focusing on the 3 most common species at that site, the 3 we see the most often. The California myotis, mica, that's the blue. The Yuma myotis is the reddish brown, and the green is lucifugans, the little brown bat, myotis lucifugans. And look at the difference, look at the green, that's lucifugans. There weren't that many of them when we started out. Their numbers increased and decreased a little bit. Quite a lot of variation over that period of time. There was a big spike in the number of Yuma myotis in 2018. And a big drop in California myotis in 2019, which is the year we found a lot of dead pups. This is another way of looking at it, which if we're shifting from thinking about the individual species to just bats over the turtleback, by stacking those lines, and you can see, yeah, there actually was an interesting expansion in bat activity in 2018, and then a drop, significant drop in bat activity in 2019. And then it started to rebound, but never got back to where it was in 2018. Maybe this is normal. We don't know, because we had no way of recording earlier than that. This begins to get us to things like, well, what are the cycles in bat activity? Are there natural cycles? Are those cycles driven by food, by prey availability? Are they driven by disease or by parasites? Why would the bat population at the turtleback crash in 2019? We know it did, but we don't know why. And this is the kind of thing we're seeing at every single one of our sites. At one site, we had complete replacement. One species just disappeared and was replaced by another species, which means that a nearby roost probably collapsed and left some available prey, left a niche open for a different species to move in. So the bat world is complex and also could be a bit violent. And one of the things that we recently saw that gave us pause was the complete elimination of one bat roost over on San Juan Island by an infectious, a contagious bat bug problem. Bat bugs are similar to bed bugs. They're actually in the same genus. So we and bats share a pest that disturbs our sleep, that climbs into our beds and disturbs our sleep. And bat bugs climb into bat roosts and bite old bats while they're trying to sleep. A bat roost on San Juan Island with 400 plus bats just decamped. They just left. And we found remains of bat bugs in their guano pile. So the inference was that they had a significant bat bug infestation, and to get rid of the bat bugs, they just abandoned the colony and moved somewhere else. We don't know very much about this because, again, bat health is difficult to, I mean, you can catch a few bats, but until we get more into routines of checking bat guano, bat fecal matter beneath roosts, not only for what they're eating, but for things that might cause them illness, you know, for viral loads, for parasites. One thing that we did last year for several bat roosts that we were able to collect guano from is we checked to see if the bats were pooping out pesticides. And it was really interesting. We ended up with good data, good clear data from 2 roosts, one on San Juan Island and one on Lopez Island, over a period of 6 months. And the one on San Juan Island, the bats were pooping out pesticide-laced insect remains. And the Lopez Island one had no traces of pesticide, which shouldn't be surprising. It's not like pesticide is everywhere. It's very much where it's being applied, where it drifts. Insects that absorb pesticides but not enough to kill them, still flying around, bats may eat them, and then the bat gets the pesticide dose and can build up maybe to a point where it affects the bat. We have no idea whether the loading of those bats was enough to compromise their health, but definitely there was measurable pesticide in their poop, and that's worrisome. It obviously raises the question that if we want bats, we have to be really careful about what we do with getting rid of bugs. And anything that we spray on bugs is likely to end up in the bellies of bats. So, I mean, this probably wasn't about pesticides, but what was it? More likely, given that it's in a pretty protected area with, as far as we know, no issues with any ag or residential chemicals or anything like that. It could have been a parasite or it could have been disease. And one of the questions right now is, would we be able to detect something like white nose syndrome should it attack a bat community here? So far, white nose syndrome in Washington state is restricted to a few observations, broadly speaking, in the Seattle-Tacoma area, King County, Pierce County, a few bats, and very recent and associated with cavers, with people, unfortunately, who went into caves that had white nose, the fungus, destructans, they went into caves on the East Coast, and then they came out here and did caving in Washington state without cleaning their clothes. And so we have these spot introductions of the white nose syndrome fungus and isolated cases of bats succumbing to white nose in the Seattle area, broadly speaking. Not up here, not likely to. All of the observations so far have been in cave or cave-like settings because the fungus requires damp, cold to survive. It's a so-called cyclic fungus that likes to be in cold, damp cave earth. So you're not going to find them in your attic. It's not the habitat for white nose, for the white nose fungus. But what about something else? recently, we were contacted by the Centers for Disease Control about 2 months ago, and they said, are you testing your bat guano for histoplasmosis? And we said, no, because there's no histoplasmosis in Western Washington. And they said, we know that, but what if, because things are moving around? Should we be testing for histoplasmosis to see if it shows up? So now we're doing that. And we're seeing monitored roosts where we are listening so we know how many bats are there, how well they're doing with this kind of data. And we're checking what they're eating and what's mixed in the guano, viruses, bacteria, fungi, parasites or parasite eggs, so that we actually can monitor bat health in a way that's in real time, where we're not looking back years, but we can tell within days or weeks whether something has gone wrong. And until we start doing something like that, the assumption continues to be that the major threat to bats in San Juan County is development, is habitat loss. And habitat loss includes things like renovating buildings when bats are in them. Having a barn fall down because it's not being used anymore, but there were bats living in the barn. Or cutting down some trees in an area where bats are hanging out and feeding on moths in the winter. That's the one I'm most concerned about, because at this point I'd say that we hear a lot from islanders that think they've got bats in a building, in a wall, in an attic, in a crawl space, and are able to work with them to either relocate the bats or work around the bats. We've done that dozens of times around Orcas Island. But what about the situation we worry about that nobody had been thinking about before? You clear 20 acres of woodland, and very often what are considered trash trees, like young Doug fir, or deciduous trees, just willow and alder, but that might have been where bats were spending the winter. And without the trees, no moths; without the moths, no bats. So getting a better sense of what real threats there are and whether we should be doing more, for example, in terms of woodland protection in order to provide for food through the winter, as opposed to just worrying about where the roosts are, the maternity roosts in the summer, and making sure that if the bats are in trouble because, for example, they're up in somebody's attic and the attic has to be renovated or the roof has to be replaced, that there's enough lead time to work on getting the bats somewhere else so that they can survive in the colony with them. I mean, that's something that we can do, we're doing now, and it's important, but it may not be enough. Yeah?
So are you checking for rabies?
So we don't check for rabies, for one thing, because there's no rabies in San Juan County right now. And to check for rabies, we have to kill bats. So at this point, we have a close working relationship with the State Department of Health, with their zoonotic diseases desk. And this is one of the things where we are sharing information so that if there is a credible report of introduction of rabies in the county, and we don't expect it to come from bats because bats are not flying back and forth to the mainland, but if there's an introduction, then we're going to have to come up with a plan to check bats. However, on the mainland, in Washington State as a whole, the big reservoirs for rabies are raccoons and other small carnivores, ground carnivores, not bats, skunks, which we don't have, but raccoons we do. And so at this point, we're just exercising vigilance, and the pharmacists and health professionals in the county are required by law to report if they suspect that anyone has contracted rabies or been bitten by a rabid animal. There was a report from Orcas last year, and it turned out it didn't pan out. So for a while, we were all mobilized, and expecting to have to intervene and find out where that came from. But it's so far turned out, and that's something we're incredibly lucky about here, that rabies has not yet been introduced into San Juan County, but we should be really. Mm-hmm.
And now in the morning when I get up.
We will always happily accept bat specimens because we can learn from them.
Okay.
I know it's, you probably, well, it's a question whether what you have is a maternity colony with moms and pups, which would ordinarily be pretty big, pretty noisy, and produce a lot of poop, like cups and cups of, one bat puts out like 2 or 3 grains a night, so little rice grains.
I'm finding probably at least 20.
5 bats. Yeah, could be, it could be just some of the boys. In the Myotis bat community, the boys are not welcome. They don't stay with the females, and they just go out and party on their own. So you often find just a few male bats, typically on the outside of a building, the eaves, the outside of the chimney, whatever. And you'll get a little deposit of pellets somewhere every night, because they'll come back and nap and poop and then go out the next night and feed and come back sometimes for weeks at a time. The males are, as is typical in the mammal world, the males are not critical for the survival of the bat community. And so there is relatively little concern about the loss of individual male bats in circumstances like that, although it's probably, I worry about any pets having interactions with bats where the pet and the bats might scratch each other up, because that's an opportunity for disease transmission if they survive in both directions. So we had a cat situation on Lopez where we think a cat got tick disease from playing with a vole that had ticks on it. It played with the vole, and then the tick was found on the cat, and the tick turned out to be infectious. So keeping cats away from small mammals that might be infectious is good for everyone, if possible, if feasible. And but at this point, the major thing that we are seeing with bats as a potential disease or a pathological issue has been bat bugs. That's the one thing that we've seen so far, and that's something that would not be passed to other animals. It's just specifically in bat roosts. But yes, Christian, who's here, is our lead on Orcas Island, and any issues about bats, Christian can pick up specimens and can also come by with a bat detector to confirm in the evening what species of bats and how many there are.
So when I do see this small pile of schedule, and where does it stay? Because
Right.
what is the daily schedule?
Okay, so the maternity colony is one thing, because that's going to be a whole bunch of females. If it's in a human structure, it'll almost certainly be mouse-eared bats, and I've rarely seen a colony smaller than 50. So lots of noise, lots of poop, and lots of evidence of the bats leaving in the evening. They'll leave right after sunset, 15 to 20 minutes after sunset, and be seen streaming out like parachute paratroopers bailing out of a troop ship. So that's one thing. But far more bat observations are just isolated males that, again, are not part of the roosts. They are only going to encounter the females briefly in the fall, around here, October generally, mate, and the females actually, they just mate, and the females store the sperm until the next spring. So it's really a one-night stand for bats. And then the boys go off and do their thing again. So a few boys, and then you get two kinds of roosts, very typically on the outside of a building. You do get sometimes boys that are sleeping there, and you'll see them tucked up in any little crack that's big enough to put your finger in. Just snuggled in, maybe with an ear sticking out or part of a wing. Those are true day roosts where they're sleeping off their nightly revels during the day, and they'll emerge at sunset individually. But there are also night roosts because bats eat several meals during a night and they travel. So what happens is that a bat will go out at sunset, have its first meal, first it'll have a drink, find a water source, and skim the water. They actually do this very elegantly. They'll fly over, they'll skim the water, take a slurp. That gets them started. Then they'll go out looking for dinner. They'll eat 50, 60, 70 bugs. Then they find a place to take a nap. And now this is like 2 hours after sunset. They'll find a place, and it's often a place that they have visited many times and they know is quiet and safe and no owls. And they'll go and they'll curl up like a cat and take a little nap, poop out 1 or 2 grains, and then early morning, 2, 3 o'clock, or just before sunrise if they ate well, they go off again. And they don't return until the following night. So you find the poop, but you never see the bat. So you're a night roost. And night roosts are very common because you've got tens of thousands of bats flying around every night, and all of them have places, including the moms. They'll come back to nurse their pups, but very often the moms will be out for 4 or 5 hours getting enough to eat, and they'll stop at places and take a nap and poop a few little grains and then finish their meals before they return to the roost to nurse their pups. So when we talk bat biology, we talk about maternity roosts, that's where the moms and pups are. Day roosts, that's where individual bats, usually the boys, are sleeping. And night roosts, which are the nap stations in between meals. Which means bats cover a lot of territory. And it's almost a surprise when you don't find any evidence of bats around the building because of the fact that so many are around and they all need places to do these things. Yes?
I have a whole bunch of.
Yes, they are. Females will delay implantation. Again, typically mating will be here in the mid-fall. On the mainland, more typically in November. Females will wait until they aggregate for their maternity roost. And it's one of those things where they're checking insect density. So female bats are flying around, they're having their nightly meal. Denser and thicker as we approach summer. And at some point, they reach a stage where somehow the experienced females feel that the insect density is high enough to have pups. And at that point, the colony comes together over a period of maybe a week. And when all the females are there, they all start implantation in synchrony, which helps the colony because then all the pups are at the same age. So they were all interchangeable in terms of taking care of them and nursing them. So that's very critical to bat survival as really tiny animals that can't produce a lot of milk, and the pup is about 1/3 of the mass of the mom. So this kind of scheduling and the ability to share fundamental trick that bats use to synchronize pupping. Ah, that's a really, really interesting question. That's very, very obvious is this synchronization of bird and bat activity in wetlands, since they're eating very often the same things and relying on the same kinds of insect swarms diurnally and nightly in order to be able to survive. One question that I've had is how that works, because we'll see hordes of swallows, for example, over a wetland by day, and then hordes of bats over the same wetland at night. And what regulates that? And is that just a free-for-all, or we don't know? We just don't know. The other big question, a little bit more, is bats are one of the mammals that is highly prone to host for parasites and pathogens, particularly viral pathogens. About the role that bats play in this ecosystem here in the islands as a reservoir for pathogens that might affect other animals, and so be part of a pathogen-like life cycle, like ticks. But then, so far, all the bats that was a problem for bats, and it turns out to be something that they can only give to other bats. On the other hand, that's what we're looking for in terms of doing bat work generally. Do they have ticks, for example? One of the stages in the development of parasites that could cause problems for other wildlife or for people. At this stage, the only answer is we haven't found one yet, but we've only been looking for a couple of years, and it's complicated and requires that we do things like sifting through bat guano for evidence of shed parasite eggs, or testing for viruses. But that's the role that bats have been found to play very interestingly in parts of the world, in tropical areas where bats are much better studied than here, is that they end up being part of a pathogen sharing network that of other species as well. And that's something where the bats and other species are passing pathogens like viruses back and forth between them. No evidence yet here, but again, we're just scratching the surface. Yes.
I'm just wondering if you might be able to speak to if you had bats in your own house, and if you wanted to find out what kind of bats they were,
Yeah.
maybe to help Russell.
First thing you can do is this library has some very cool bat detectors. It's very similar to the bat detectors that we use, and at this point, the best instrument in the trade for doing investigations, not for doing this kind of every night monitoring, 24/7, 365 days a year, But for going and saying, what bats are in my attic, or what bats are flying over my pond, the way to do it is to use a bat detector like this, which is just a microphone that attaches to a phone or tablet. Real simple little device. It's the ultrasound microphone. The software is a downloadable app that's free once you buy the microphone. And you don't have to buy it because you are lucky enough to have the Orcas library here. They have some for loan. But this plugs into your phone or your tablet. You can then, once it plugs in, you can download the app. And what you do very simply is you switch it on, choose the app, and start it. It's got a red button like a tape recorder that starts recording. And when it's recording, it's producing a record that you could share with us, plus giving you real-time identification of the bat the instrument is recording. And that is actually one thing to be very careful about, is the way these things work is you have to be recording for the machine to start auto-identifying what it's hearing, because it actually goes back and takes a few seconds to analyze the sounds that you've already recorded. So I would strongly recommend these. That's what Christian and I use when we do investigations in a particular property.